I never thought the day I turned 65 would be the day I finally understood what the last decade of my life had actually cost me. Not in regret, I had none of that. Not yet, but in the cold arithmetic of sacrifice. The kind of math you never want to do but eventually can't avoid. It started at breakfast on a Thursday morning in April. My son Derek sat across from me at the kitchen table in the house I'd helped him buy in Naperville 3 years ago. Not helped, paid for. $220,000 from the sale of my home in Evanston, the one his mother and I had lived in for 24 years, the one I'd sold 6 months after she passed. Because I couldn't afford the upkeep alone on a retired engineer's pension, and because Derek had said, "Dad, we'd love to have you here. We have the room, the kids need their grandfather." So I sold it. I handed him the check. I moved into their spare bedroom with 2 suitcases and a box of books, and told myself this was what family did. That Thursday morning, my son had the same look on his face he'd had since he was 16 and wanted to borrow the car, a specific combination of guilt and entitlement, where the guilt was real but the entitlement was stronger. His wife Stephanie stood at the counter behind him, arms folded, staring at the window above the sink like the backyard had something important to say. "Dad, we've been talking." His voice was careful. "Rehearsed. About what?" "About the arrangement." "About you living here." I set down my coffee. "What about it?" "The kids are getting older. They need more space." Stephanie looked at me then, briefly, then back at the window. "We've been looking at some places for you. Independent living communities. There's a really nice one in Wheaton. Actually has a golf simulator and everything. You always liked golf." I hadn't played golf in 11 years. Stephanie knew that. I don't know if she'd forgotten or if it didn't matter. I looked at my son. "Derek, I pay $3,800 a month toward this mortgage. You contribute to expenses, yes. But Dad, that's not really the point. Then what is the point?" He finally looked at me directly. "The point is that this isn't working. Stephanie and I need our home to feel like our home. You're in the living room when we want to watch something. You're in the kitchen when she's trying to meal prep. The kids come home from school and go straight to your room instead of doing their homework. You're—" "Say it." He swallowed. "You're everywhere, Dad. All the time. And we love you. But we need our space back." I thought about the Tuesday nights I'd picked up his son from soccer practice, when Stephanie had her book club and Derek had a work dinner. I thought about the 3 weeks I'd stayed up with my granddaughter Emma when she had pneumonia and Stephanie was traveling for work and Derek was pulling 60-hour weeks. I thought about the gutters I'd cleaned twice a year, the furnace filter I changed every month, the grocery runs, the homework help, the $400 I'd slipped Derek last November when his transmission went out and they were between paychecks. "When would you like me to leave?" Stephanie turned from the window. "Well, we were thinking the end of the month would give you time to—" I looked at my son, Derek. "When?" He couldn't hold my eyes. "Soon would be better, honestly. There's a room available at the Wheaton place starting next week. We already put a deposit down." "You put a deposit down?" "Just to hold the spot. You don't have to take it." But we thought, what I cost a month at that place, he didn't say. What the deposit meant, he didn't say. What the $220,000 had bought me a year and a half of being tolerated in a house I'd subsidized, he didn't say. I stood up. "I'll be out by Friday." "Dad, you don't have to." "Friday, Derek. I'll call a cab." I went upstairs and I packed. Not everything there, wasn't room in 2 suitcases for everything but the things that mattered. A photograph of my wife Carol from 1987, the year we got married, standing in front of Wrigley Field in that green jacket she wore until the elbows went. My father's watch. My engineering license, which I'd kept framed on the wall even after retirement because it had mattered once. A few books. Some clothes. My grandchildren were at school. I left without saying goodbye to them, which I've thought about every day since. I didn't want them to see my face. Derek drove me to the metro station. He offered, and I accepted because I had 3 suitcases now, and the cab would have been $40 I didn't want to spend. The ride was 12 minutes, and neither of us said anything for 11 of them. At the station, he helped me with my bags. He opened his mouth twice and closed it. The third time something came out. "Happy birthday, Dad." He said it quietly, like he was ashamed of it. It was April 14th, my 65th birthday. I had forgotten completely. "Thank you," I said. I picked up my bags and walked inside. I sat in the Naperville metro station for 2 hours before I admitted to myself that I didn't know where I was going. I had 2 suitcases, a carry-on and a pension, that after Derek's mortgage contribution left me with $612 a month. My checking account had $440 in it. I had no lease, no hotel reservation, no plan. My brother lived in Phoenix, and we were close enough, but asking him to wire me money for a flight on my birthday while explaining I'd just been evicted by my son felt like a humiliation. I couldn't survive that particular afternoon. My 2 friends from the engineering firm, both retired, both with their own situations. I'd been so wrapped up in Derek's household for 18 months that I'd let those friendships go thin, the way you let grass go without water and then act surprised when it dies. I bought a cup of coffee from the station kiosk and sat on a wooden bench outside on the platform and tried to think. The April air was cool, and the sky over the western suburbs was that particular pale gray that Chicago does in spring. Not quite threatening rain, not quite offering sun. A train came and went. Another came and went. A man pulled himself into the space at the far end of my bench. He was older than me by at least 20 years. Maybe more lean in the way of men who've been lean their whole lives. White hair cut short, wearing a sport coat over a flannel shirt. He moved with a cane, one of those 4-pronged hospital canes, and he settled himself carefully, putting the cane across his knees once he was seated. He had hearing aids in both ears, the small behind-the-ear kind. He looked out at the tracks for a while. Then he looked at me. "You've been on that bench for almost 2 hours," he said. His voice was clear and dry. Not an accusation, an observation. I blinked. "Have you been watching me?" "Not watching, noticing. There's a difference. When you get old enough, you learn to notice things because you miss them if you don't." He tilted his head slightly, the way people with hearing loss sometimes do, directing the good ear. "You going somewhere? Or sitting?" "Sitting, mostly." I smiled despite myself. I need to figure out where I'm going. That's a heavy thing to figure out on a train platform. I surprised myself. I told him, not everything, not right away, but enough. That I'd been living with my son, that my son had asked me to leave, that it was my birthday, and I had less than $500, and nowhere obvious to go. He listened without interrupting, which is rarer than people think. When I finished, he looked back at the tracks. "How long were you in his house?" 18 months. He nodded slowly. "And you paid toward the mortgage, $3,800 a month." He turned to look at me directly then. His eyes were pale blue and very clear. "How much did you put in for the down payment?" I hesitated. $220,000. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry. That's a hard thing. Not just the money. The money is just money. But the belief that went with it. The belief that it meant something to him. That you meant enough to be worth having around." That one caught me somewhere in the chest, and I had to look away. "My name is Walter Greer," he said. "I was an architect. Retired 20 years ago. Mostly I still consult occasionally. Can't entirely let go." He paused. "I have a problem, and I wonder if you might help me with it. It would require you to trust me for a little while, and I understand if you're not inclined toward trust right now." I looked at him. He was 80-something years old, sitting on a train platform in Naperville with a 4-pronged cane across his knees. I don't know what it was, something in how he'd listened, something in how he'd said the belief that went with it, like he understood the specific shape of that wound from the inside. But I said, "What kind of problem?" "I have a car coming," he said. "I'd like you to ride with me. I need someone to help me with a few things at my house this afternoon, reading some correspondence, helping me sort through some files. My eyes aren't what they were, and my regular assistant is out sick." He paused. "In exchange, you're welcome to use my guest room tonight while you sort out your situation." I almost said no. The instinct was there a stranger, an offer too neat. What kind of person invites someone they've known 20 minutes to their home? But I thought about the $440 in my checking account, and the $600 hotel rates in Chicago, and the conversation I'd have to have with my brother in Phoenix, and I said, "All right, I'll help you." His car was a black Lincoln Town car, older model but immaculate, driven by a young man named Marcus who called Walter sir with what seemed like genuine respect. Marcus took my suitcases without being asked and loaded them into the trunk without comment, and I thought, this is either entirely fine or it's the beginning of something I'll regret, and either way I've already agreed. We drove north and east, back toward the city. Walter sat beside me in the back seat and didn't say much. He watched out the window. Once he said, I always liked April in Illinois. People forget how good it gets after February. I agreed that they did. We ended up in Kenilworth. If you don't know Kenilworth, it's the kind of suburb that exists as proof that some people in the Midwest have more money than most people will ever see in their lives. Old houses, large lots, mature trees, a general atmosphere of quiet, accumulated wealth. The house Walter's car pulled into was a 1920s Craftsman on a deep lot. The kind of house an architect would own proportion everywhere. Everything deliberate. A porch that looked like it had been designed specifically to watch summer evenings from. Inside, it was warm and ordered. Bookshelves, drafting tables that hadn't been used in years but were still in place, architectural models behind glass in the hallway. A woman named Dorothy, who turned out to be his housekeeper of 31 years, brought us coffee before I'd even sat down. Walter took me to his study, which looked out on a garden that in another 6 weeks would be extraordinary. He showed me a pile of correspondence letters from lawyers, mostly, and some financial documents, and explained that his eyes made sustained reading difficult. He had macular degeneration in his right eye and cataracts pending surgery in the left. I spent 2 hours reading to him. Legal letters about an estate matter, some invoices from contractors working on a property he owned in Wisconsin, a long letter from someone named Philip, who turned out to be a former business partner. Walter listened, asked occasional questions, made notes in a pad with large handwriting. At 6, Dorothy came to tell us dinner was ready. I assumed I'd eat in the kitchen, but Walter led me to the dining room, a proper dining room, the kind with a table that seated 10, and we sat at one end of it together. Dorothy made pot roast. Walter poured wine from a bottle that had been opened earlier, and breathed long enough to be excellent. We ate and talked, and somewhere in the second glass of wine I stopped feeling like a guest in a stranger's house and started feeling like a person again, which I hadn't felt since that morning. He told me about his wife Margaret, who had died 4 years ago. 41 years of marriage, he said. She used to say, I worked too hard, and I told her she was right and then kept working anyway. He paused. The things we know and do nothing about. He told me about his daughter, who lived in Seattle and called every Sunday without fail. His son, who lived in London and called less often but always remembered birthdays. He had grandchildren he saw twice a year. It wasn't the same as I imagined it would be, he said. Having children, I thought there'd be more presence, but they have their lives. I understand. I just didn't expect to understand it this soon. I told him about Carol, about what she'd been like, not just who she was, how she'd laughed at everything, genuinely, a full-body laugh that embarrassed Derek sometimes in restaurants, how she'd read 3 books a week her whole adult life, how the house in Evanston had felt like her more than mine, which was why selling it had felt like selling her twice. Walter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You gave your son that money because she would have wanted you to. I hadn't said that. I hadn't thought it in exactly those words. But when he said it, I recognized it as true the way you recognize something you've always known. Yes, I said. That's the thing about grief, he said. It makes us generous in ways that can be exploited by people who love us less than we love them. He let me stay the week, then another. He never asked me to leave, and I never pushed the conversation about when I should, because the arrangement had already quietly become something else. I was useful to him, not as an employee but as company, as someone to eat with and talk to and play chess with badly in the evenings. He was useful to me in the same way. We were 2 older men doing the work of not being alone. After 3 weeks, he said, formally, over dinner, I'd like you to stay on. I have a project I've been meaning for years to write something about the buildings I designed, the philosophy behind them, what I was thinking and what I was trying to do. My daughter says I should write a book. I don't know about a book, but I'd like to get it down. You could help me with that. Research, organizing, reading back what I've written to hear how it sounds. An exchange room, board, and I'll pay you for your time. $50,000 a year. Walter, that's I started. It's fair, he said. I'm asking for real work and real time. You should be compensated. He paused. Don't argue with me about this. I'm 84, and I've been arguing with people about money my whole career. I'll win. So I stayed. The work was real and interesting. Walter had designed 43 significant buildings over a career that spanned 4 decades: hospitals, civic centers, university libraries, private homes for people whose names I recognized. He remembered every one of them in extraordinary detail. I'd read him a photograph description from an architecture journal, and he'd close his eyes and reconstruct the whole design process from memory, the arguments with clients, the engineering compromises, the things he loved and the things he'd been forced to accept. He dictated. I transcribed. I read it back. We revised. We argued about structure and clarity, which was the most alive I'd felt since I'd retired. He was sharp and funny and precise, and he expected you to hold up your end of a conversation. I did. In the evenings, we'd eat together and then sit in the living room, him with his audiobooks and me with a paperback, and sometimes we'd talk and sometimes we wouldn't. Dorothy went home at 8, and the house would settle into a comfortable quiet that I came to depend on. I called Derek twice in those first 2 months. Short calls. He asked how I was. I said fine. He said good. Neither of us went any further than that. I didn't tell him where I was staying. Not out of strategy, it simply didn't come up, and I found I wasn't ready to offer it. This part of my life felt like mine in a way that living in his spare room never had. I was in the study one morning in late June, reading back a passage Walter had dictated about a library he'd designed in Evanston in 1979, when Dorothy came in. There's a man at the door, she said, says he's your son. I felt something cold move through my chest. How did he? I looked at Walter. Walter's expression was very still. How did he find this address? Dorothy, show him to the living room. We'll be there in a moment. In the hallway, quietly, Walter said. The Wisconsin property I own. There was a minor local news piece about the renovation 2 months ago. My name in it, this address. If someone were looking, so he was looking. It appears so. The question, Walter said, is what he wants. I knew what he wanted. I walked into the living room already knowing. Derek stood near the fireplace with Stephanie beside him. He'd dressed carefully pressed shirt. Good shoes the way he dressed for job interviews or meeting clients. He looked around the room first, at the architectural models and the original art and the quality of everything, and I watched his face do the math. Dad. He came toward me. We've been worried. You called twice in 2 months, Derek. Well, you were being, he gestured vaguely private about your situation. We didn't want to push. He was looking past me at Walter, who had followed me in and taken a seat. His eyes registered the cane, the age, the hearing aids, the obvious wealth of the room. And then they registered something else possibility. I'm Derek Morrison, he said to Walter, stepping forward with his hand out. Thomas's son. And this is my wife Stephanie. Walter shook his hand. I'm Walter Greer. I can hear perfectly well in this ear, so no need to speak up. Mr. Greer, Derek said, it's wonderful to meet you. We're so glad our father has had someone to keep him company. He's always been the kind of person who... Derek. I kept my voice level. Why are you here? He looked at me. We want you to come home, Dad. We talked it over and we were too hasty. Stephanie and I both know that. Stephanie nodded with the expression of someone who has agreed to say something she wasn't certain she believed. We miss you. The kids miss you. Emma had called me 3 times on Walter's house phone, which I'd given her, because I hadn't told her I had a new cell number yet. She missed me because she'd been 5 when her grandmother died, and I was the person in the house who talked to her like an adult, not because her parents had sent her. I knew the difference. What changed? I asked. Nothing changed. Stephanie's voice went careful and warm in a way it hadn't often been with me before. We just had some time to think and we realized we overreacted. Families should be together. Walter cleared his throat gently. Forgive me. I don't mean to intrude on a family conversation, but I'm curious about something. Stephanie, when is Thomas's birthday? Stephanie blinked. April 14th. She got it. A pause of about 4 seconds, but she got it. You drove my father to a train station on his 65th birthday, I said. You'd put a deposit on an assisted living room without asking me. You told me I was everywhere, all the time, like it was something to be ashamed of. We were stressed, Derek said. The mortgage, the kids' schedules. I gave you the mortgage, Derek. $220,000. Do you understand that I can say that and it's just true? It's not an accusation. It's arithmetic. You offered, he said. You wanted to help. Yes, I did. And then when I'd given you what you needed, you put me on a train platform with 3 suitcases on my birthday and hoped I'd figure something out. The room was very quiet. Walter sat with his hands folded on his cane, and he was listening with the particular intensity of someone who knows how to hear the things that aren't said. Mr. Morrison, Derek tried, turning to Walter. I think you can understand that we were concerned about our father's situation here. We didn't know anything about you and an elderly man living in a stranger's home. We just want to make sure everything is above board. His voice was smooth and collegial, the voice he used with clients. Walter regarded him for a moment. Above board, he repeated. You know what I mean. No offense intended. None taken. I understand your concern completely. His tone was dry and even. You want to know whether your father is here by choice and whether anyone is taking advantage of him. Exactly. Derek nodded, relieved the vocabulary had been supplied. Then let me answer that. Your father is here because I asked him to stay. He helps me with my work. I pay him fairly. He has his own room, his own time, and he's free to leave whenever he chooses. He hasn't chosen to. He paused. I'll also tell you that in the 2 months I've known your father, he's mentioned you twice. You've called him twice. I mention this not to be unkind, but to let you calculate the ratio yourself. Derek's jaw tightened. Dad, I know why you're here, I said. I don't know exactly how you found out a news article maybe, or something you found online. But you know who Walter is. You looked him up, and you figured out something that made it worth the drive. That's not... It is, though. I kept my voice quiet. Derek, I know you. I've known you for 38 years. I know what your voice sounds like when you're working an angle, because I watched you figure out how to do it. You learned it partly from watching me close deals, and I'm not proud of the lesson. He had nothing to say to that. The thing is, I said, I don't hate you for it. I'm your father. I can be hurt by you and disappointed in you and still love you, because that's what being a parent means. It's unconditional in a way that doesn't make sense if you've never done it. But I need you to hear me say this clearly. You don't get to come in here with your wife in your good shoes and your concerned old son face and expect to walk back what you did just because the circumstances have changed. Stephanie spoke then, quietly. Thomas? Mrs. Morrison, Walter said. Forgive me again, he was careful and precise. I want to be honest with you both, since you've come a long way. I'm 84 years old, and I have some health issues that I manage. I have a daughter in Seattle and a son in London, and I see them when schedules permit. Thomas is not my caretaker. He's not here under any false pretense, and he's under no obligation to share anything about our arrangement with you. He paused. That said, I'll tell you this much. I have a high regard for your father. He's a man of exceptional character, and I consider him a genuine friend. Whatever you think his situation here means for you, I'd ask you to remember that he didn't come to it by strategy. He came to it by being the kind of person he is. The kind of person he apparently raised you to overlook. Derek said nothing. Stephanie looked at the floor. Richard will show you out, Walter said. Dorothy would, but I think she's making lunch, and I'd hate for it to get cold. After they left, I stood at the window and watched the Lincoln back down the driveway. I'm sorry, I said. I never meant to bring that into your home. Don't. He was dismissive, but not unkind. That was clarifying. Sit down. I sat. He poured 2 small glasses of scotch from a decanter on the side table, which was not something we did before lunch as a rule, and handed me one. I want to tell you something, he said. I've been meaning to say it for a few weeks, but I wanted to be certain first. All right. He turned the glass in his hands. I have a good cardiologist, but a realistic one. The shorthand is that my heart is doing approximately as well as an 84-year-old heart does, which is to say adequately for now and uncertainly for later. He paused. I've put my affairs in order. I've done this several times over the years. My wife and I updated our documents every 5 years. She was very organized, and my estate documents are current. But I've been thinking about something specific since you came to stay here, and I want to tell you what I've decided. Walter, let me finish. He looked at me steadily. I have 2 children who love me and have good lives. They'll receive specific bequests this house, certain accounts, things they know about. I'm not leaving them empty-handed, but I have a significant portion of my estate that's in the form of a real estate trust properties in Wisconsin and Michigan, some commercial holdings that still generate income, and I've been undecided about its disposition for 2 years. I had a foundation in mind at one point, and I may still do that with part of it. But I've been watching you for 3 months, Thomas. I've watched you read to an old man every morning and never once looked like you were doing him a favor. I've watched you call my granddaughter back before you returned calls to your own son. I've watched you fix the fence post in the garden that bothered me every time I walked past it, without being asked, without mentioning it. He stopped. You're a good man. Not a sentimental man, which I appreciate. A good man, and I don't have enough of those in my life. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. I wanted you to know. My attorney is Robert Hines. You'll meet him eventually. He has my instructions. When the time comes, you'll have stability. Real stability, not the kind that depends on someone else's goodwill. He paused again. I'm not telling you this to obligate you or to make what you do here transactional. I'm telling you because you deserve to know there's ground under you, that someone sees you clearly and values what they see. I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, I didn't come here for anything, I know that. That's exactly why. Walter passed on a Wednesday in November, early morning, in his own bedroom, with Dorothy downstairs starting coffee and me 2 doors down. The hospice nurse who'd been coming 3 times a week had told us it would likely be soon, and it was. He'd been comfortable, she said. He'd been ready. The memorial was held the following week at the Chicago Architecture Foundation, which he'd helped build. The building itself was essentially a guest of honor. His daughter flew in from Seattle, his son from London, and I met them both for the first time they knew who I was. Walter had mentioned me to both of them. His daughter Julia took my hand for a long moment and said, He told me you made him laugh at breakfast every day. That means more than you know. I spoke at the memorial. I hadn't been asked to initially, but Julia asked me 2 days before, and I said yes because Walter deserved someone to say something true about who he'd been, not just what he'd built. I talked about the bench at the Naperville metro station. I talked about how he'd heard something in 3 minutes of conversation that my son hadn't heard in 38 years. I talked about pot roast and chess and the way he listened with his whole body turned slightly, making sure the good ear caught everything. I did not talk about money. Robert Hines called me into his office in the Loop 6 days later. He was a precise man in his late 60s, the kind of lawyer who explained things once and expected you to have followed. Walter's estate was organized the way Walter organized everything methodically, with visible logic, leaving no room for ambiguity. The house in Kenilworth to Julia, a property in Wisconsin to his son. Specific accounts and personal items as Walter had described. The real estate trust 8 properties, primarily residential and mixed use, current valuation approximately $4 million, generating annual income of approximately $240,000 was directed in full to me. I sat with that for a moment. Robert looked at me over the documents. He was very deliberate in his decisions, Mr. Morrison. He'd revised this particular designation 3 times over the past decade. He made the final revision in September, 2 months after you came to stay. He handed me a letter. He left this for you. The letter was short, written in Walter's oversized handwriting on his personal stationery. Thomas, you may feel this is too much. It isn't. What I'm leaving you cost you nothing to earn, which is the most valuable thing about it. You earned it by being decent and present and genuinely interested in who I was, not what I had. That's rarer than it should be. I've asked Robert to be patient with questions and Dorothy to stay on with the house for as long as you'd like. Take your time figuring out what this means. You have it now. Use it quietly and well. My only request is that you visit the grave now and then, and argue with me about the Cubs, which I expect you to do anyway. W.G. Dorothy was in the kitchen when I got back that evening. She'd made soup, the way she made soup whenever something hard had happened. She'd been making it for 30 years in that house. You all right? She asked. I think so. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same one Walter and I had eaten at every evening. I'm going to need some time to figure out what comes next. She nodded, She understood. She'd known Walter long enough to understand what it meant when a life reorganized itself. I called Derek that night. Not because I had to. Not because I wanted anything from him or wanted to give him anything. I called him because Walter had said once, in one of those evening conversations that went longer than either of us planned, "The worst thing unfair treatment can do to you is make you into someone who keeps score. Don't let it. It poisons the ledger, and you're the one who has to carry it." Derek answered on the third ring. "Hey, Dad, I want to tell you something," I said. No agenda, just information. He was quiet, waiting. "Walter passed away this month. He was a good man, and I'm grateful I knew him, even briefly." I paused. "I'm going to be staying at his house in Kenilworth for the foreseeable future. I have stability here. You don't need to worry about my situation." "Dad," I heard him adjust, recalibrate. "Dad, I'm sorry. About Walter. And I'm sorry about April. I know. I meant what I said when I came to see you. I know it didn't land right. I know Stephanie and I made it look like something it wasn't. But I miss you. The kids miss you. Emma asks about you every week. I know she does. She calls me." He was quiet for a moment. "Can I bring the kids to see you?" Not for any reason, except that. Emma and Jack want to see you. I want to see you." I thought about Walter's advice, and about the letter on his stationery, and about the specific grief of having a child who does something unforgivable and then has to live with the question of whether you'll forgive it. "Anyway, Christmas," I said. "Bring the kids for Christmas. We'll have Dorothy make her pot roast, and I'll tell the kids about the man who used to live here and what he taught me. Then we'll see where we are." "Thank you, Dad." His voice was low. I heard something in it that sounded like the son I'd raised. The actual one, not the one that stress and entitlement and Stephanie had temporarily obscured. "Thank you for giving me the chance." "One chance," I said. "That's all any of us get to ask for." After I hung up, I sat in Walter's study, my study, I supposed, though that word hadn't settled into anything natural yet, and looked out at the garden. Dark now, but visible from the porch light, the bare oak and the stone path, and the koi pond Walter had said he'd built for Margaret 30 years ago because she liked the sound of water. I thought about the Naperville metro station, about the particular cold of a Chicago April morning, about sitting on a platform with 3 suitcases and a birthday no one had remembered and believing, not in a theatrical way but in a very quiet and specific way, that I had become irrelevant, that the best of what I'd been was behind me and hadn't added up to what I'd hoped. I thought about Walter sitting at the other end of that bench, not watching, noticing. You look like you're waiting for something that's not coming. He'd been right, and he'd been wrong. What I'd been waiting for hadn't been coming, not from Marcus, not from that train platform, not from the next pension check. But something had been coming anyway, from a direction I hadn't thought to look. A man I'd known 4 months had seen me more clearly than people who'd known me 40 years. He'd left me something I'd never asked for and wouldn't have imagined asking for. Not because of the money was consequence, not cause. He'd left me what he'd said at that bench without knowing he was saying it. The belief that what I'd been, and still was, meant something. That a life of decent choices had accumulated into something real, even when the people closest to me had stopped seeing it. I picked up the phone and called Dorothy. "The oak in the back garden," I said. "Walter ever talk about doing anything with that space?" She laughed. "Every spring for 20 years. He always said he'd put a proper sitting area out there. Never got around to it. Would you have any idea where I'd start with something like that?" She paused, pleased. "I know exactly the person to call." I hung up and looked out at the dark garden, at the oak Walter had always meant to do something about, and I thought, there it is. A reason to get up tomorrow. A reason that's mine. That's what he gave me. Not the house, not the trust, not the income. A reason that belonged to me again, that no one could take back by changing their mind about whether I was convenient. I owed him a Cubs argument at the grave, and I intended to deliver one. Dorothy called at 7 in the morning, and I was already dressed when she got there, standing in the kitchen making coffee the way he'd shown me 2 minutes on the Bloom. Then the slow pour, looking out at the garden and thinking about what came next. Not with dread. For the first time in longer than I wanted to calculate, not with dread.